anyways, which is awesome. All right, so today we're going to talk about different languages, the advantages, whatever, all the different stuff about them. Maybe what different people use different languages for and all that jazz. Cool. Maybe let's start out by just listing some languages that we know. What languages have y'all heard of?
C#.
Ooh, C#. Give me a second. Cool. Hang on a moment. C#. What was it? Python? What else we got? JavaScript. Ruby.
Java. Regular
Yeah.
Java.
Java.
PHP.
PHP. A lot of fucking languages, right?
Yes.
Here's some more I can spout off. Rust. Elixir. Dart is the one that I'm working in right now. Perl. There's MATLAB. There's what else do we got?
C and C++.
Kitty script is one. There's also one that's like all spaces somehow. I don't know exactly how it works. Yep, C, C++. There's also like B and F. I don't think they're widely used anymore. At some point, there was probably an A. There's, what else do we got? There's fucking, it's the one I'm thinking of. There's one that's like mathy and old. Fortran. Fortran's like one of the oldest languages. I think it's
Assembly.
Assembly. So assembly would be less of a specific language and more of like a language type, which we could talk about in a minute. Cool. All right, so these are just to be like, hey, let's think of, there's a lot of fucking languages, and that's cool. There's nothing wrong with that. I could name more off my head than this, but just to let y'all know, like there's a lot of them, and they all have different purposes, and they all do different things. They all fit in little different areas. Some of them are like alternatives to each other, and some of them you can't really swap them out. So we're going to talk about the different ones, what they're for, and why. Sweet. Let's go into, I made a little README here. Whoopsie daisies. Everything decided to open at once. Cool. My first question for y'all is, do y'all know the difference between a high-level language and a low-level language? And holy shit, I have to quit out of some applications because my computer is just, oy, not doing so hot. Quit out of that.
So like high level would be like not assembly languages.
Yeah. So like, let's define exactly what that means. High-level languages are further removed from the actual thing that makes a computer, is what I would say. In other words, what makes a computer work at the end of the day, it's ones and zeros. The lowest level language for us would be binary. One step removed from binary would be like assembly language. And assembly language is not the same for every machine that it's on. Assembly would be like, oh, here's an assembly language for this particular piece of hardware. You don't need to be very versed in how to make assembly language. There's a good chance you'll never write a line of assembly language in your life, and that's okay. But assembly is like that next level of abstraction there. Let's get a look at what each of these looks like. So, binary is just ones and zeros. What does assembly code look like? Maybe so you just have an idea if you ever see it. Looks something like this. Not very easy on the eyes, right? And it's not really like, I think that the whole purpose of an assembly language is to basically build a template to write other languages on top of. Because you don't generally want to program something in assembly when you have some kind of wrapper for it that a human could read and understand and interpret. Cool. But just so you get an idea of what assembly is. Now, in general, as we go higher in languages, they become easy. Here's the trade-off. Let's do this. As we go higher on this chain, languages become two things. One, easier to read / write. Two, less flexible on how we can configure it. Also, some side effects of that is that often they'll become slower. They run slower. As in, like, the amount of time it takes to get from one line of code to the next line of code is higher. It takes more time to run the same, like, algorithm or something like that. And cool. Sometimes this will result in more safety. What do I mean by that? We'll kind of go into that a little bit later. But when you can do anything, sometimes that also allows you the flexibility to do something that's bad, not just something that's good. So a lot of times these layers of abstraction stop us from doing bad things, as well as not allowing us to configure things in a certain way. So it's not always a bad thing that we are less flexible. Sometimes that's a good thing. Cool. All right, awesome. What are some low-level languages?
Is C sharp?
C is, C++ is, C# is not.
Okay.
And C and C++ are used for games and robotics and stuff like that, yeah?
Yeah, I think yeah, because they run very, very, very fast. So yeah, there are a lot of game developers will know a good chunk of C++. Anybody know any other low-level languages? Another one that's gaining a lot of popularity is called Rust. Rust is like very similar to C++, but they made things called type safety on it, which is cool. Don't worry too much about that. Also, another thing that happens is they become like more stuff has to be installed onto a computer to run it as languages get higher. This is the only reason why I know this, and I know that it's pertinent, is because my brother currently does he's an embedded development person, and he works with like these very, very small devices with not a lot of memory. So he has to basically do his stuff in C++. I asked him if Rust was an option, and according to him, which I have heard conflicting opinions on this, but according to him, he doesn't think it would be viable because Rust is a larger package than C++. Someone else told me that my brother might be wrong, though, which is kind of interesting. But other languages, they do require, like, if we think about it, right, if both languages are compiling down to assembly code, you probably need more code to figure out what code actually means in a higher language. We could talk about that a little bit more as we get to it. You'll kind of start to see what I mean.
And when you talk about low-level languages and high-level languages, is that kind of synonymous with what you're talking about yesterday, the type strength or type weakness? I forget what the term you used.
Yeah, we're going to talk about those.
Okay.
Hint, hint, hint. Got a whole bunch on that. So what I'll say on that is that it tends to be that lower level languages are strongly typed. But there's also other features to them that make them even more low level. And that's not necessarily what makes it low level. I don't, at a certain point, the definition of low and high gets a little bit fuzzy. There's like more concrete definitions for things like, is this statically typed? Is this thing dynamically typed? But like try to put a metric on how far removed something is from the software, and that gets from like ones and zeros, and that becomes a little bit trickier to define and probably requires some knowledge of the history of the language and how it was built. So for example, TypeScript right, is very far removed because it's actually TypeScript actually compiles to JavaScript. So if you think about it, if TypeScript is actually a layer above JavaScript, even though TypeScript is strongly typed, statically typed, and all of that. That being said, a low-level language like C++ is also strongly typed, statically typed, and all that jazz. And it's much closer to the hardware than something like TypeScript. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Sweet. Cool. So C# is a high level, higher, I'll say higher. Java is a higher level. Ruby is higher level. Python is higher level. By the way, these two, strongly and statically typed. What else do we have? JavaScript is higher level language. Any other questions on ones that you're not sure where it fits in? Like we could go back to our list and take a look at it, wherever it may be. Cool. So I'm gonna make this full screen. That I can kind of flip. So MATLAB, I don't actually know where MATLAB fits into that, but I think it's like high level probably. Fortran, I don't actually know either, but you know. Does everybody understand roughly what high level, low level means?
I think so.
All right, so now what does OOP language mean?
Object-oriented programming.
Okay, so it means the language supports object-oriented programming.
Which is like what we learned yesterday with like making a class and doing all that.
So this is like a fuzzy kind of definition also. Like someone could argue that JavaScript is an OOP language because it supports object-oriented programming, but also since it's not like real object-oriented programming, it's kind of fake. I don't think people would call JavaScript an object-oriented programming language, but it still might be valid to say that JavaScript supports OOP. Certain languages do a much better job of supporting OOP. C#, let's talk about just some instances of languages. OOP languages for sure. So this would be stuff like C#, object-oriented, Java, object-oriented, Ruby, object-oriented. Python like supports it. I don't know that it's like exclusively object-oriented, but
What else would it be if you say exclusively? So what's the other part?
The best way I could describe this is I've programmed in these languages and it feels very different from programming in the other ones because in these languages, everything is kind of supposed to be object-oriented paradigm. Like, I think the best way for us to think about like internalize what an object-oriented paradigm is like now versus like a functional programming paradigm, which when I use the word paradigm, because a lot of this is how you code inside of the language, not necessarily how the language is written, right? So when we were maybe doing stuff in JavaScript, we were writing functions and more functions and functions that were doing all these things. We were calling things. That was like largely functional programming, not entirely functional programming, because we were still using things like objects, for example, when we would do like URL search params, right? It wasn't like pure functional programming, but for the most part, the way we were coding felt very functional. In Ruby, in contrast, right? Think about like Blood Oath or think about like your Mod 1 code challenge. When you were going through that, what did that feel like? It kind of felt like, oh, I have this thing. I have a restaurant and my restaurant can have reviews and my restaurant has these methods attached to it and my restaurant behaves in this way. That's like more how you program when you're in OOP language. So like in the case of C#, Java, Ruby, it tends to be that like the frameworks that you use and the way that you program things tends to always kind of be more object oriented.
But can't any of those also be functional?
So yeah, like there's features that like, this is where it gets kind of iffy, right? So Ruby does not support functional programming very well. Like, for example, if you're curious on like a demonstration of this, in JavaScript, like you can do functional programming in Ruby, but Ruby makes it difficult. So let's open up a JavaScript one, and I am going to say like function double num bam, and then I will say return num times 2, right? Well, first of all, I could console log this function. I could actually print out this function. Whoops, not function. It should be double. I can pass this function around like a variable, and that's something that like it's kind of essential for real functional programming. Let's try the same thing in Ruby and see what happens. So if I go here and I say def double a number, return number times 2. What do you think is going to happen if I console.log double?
Well, you can't do console.log, but
Oh, sorry.
What?
Puts. What do you think I'm going to get back? By default, it actually tries to invoke double. So I can't like pass it around like a variable, right? I have to invoke it. Otherwise, it's like, what is even going on right now? I can't pass around a function like a variable in Ruby. So Ruby does not support functional programming very well. That being said, there's like a hacky thing you could do in Ruby called do like yield blocks. It's kind of weird. You did it in the pre-work a little bit and then forgot about it entirely, which so have I, so don't worry. So this is kind of a way to do functional programming in Ruby. I'm not good at doing it, so I'm not even gonna like convince you to go down that rabbit hole. Just know that it's like not the same. It's like similar, and you can do kind of functional programming things, but the language doesn't support it that well. Likewise, there are also some languages that don't support OOP. So languages that can do it but aren't restricted. This is where I would probably throw Python. I would throw JavaScript in here. Dart I would throw in here from my experience. What else? I don't know. That's maybe a good intro. I think C++ would fall under that category. C++ was basically a modified version of C to add object-oriented programming into it. But I don't think you're also like required to do object-oriented programming in C++. C++ is a more common language for people than C, I think, at this point. I think I've read that somewhere, but I'm not 100% sure. But if y'all are curious. I don't know about Rust. Java is definitely object-oriented. Ruby is definitely object-oriented. I don't know what kind of things you can do in those languages. So like, I don't know all these languages, so give me a break here. But I think Swift would fall under this category. And I don't know about Kotlin. Kotlin, I would imagine Kotlin would be more along these lines, but I don't know.
What about like Flutter and stuff? Those aren't languages,
Dart.
right? Those are frameworks.
Dart,
Dart.
is
Okay.
the language that Flutter runs off of. Flutter as a framework feels very object-oriented, but you can do functional programming in Dart pretty well.
So would it be accurate to say Flutter is to Dart as Rails is to Ruby?
Very accurate. That's exactly what it is.
I'm just trying to make sense of all this. Okay.
No, that's fine.
is that Swift? Swift is for iOS, right?
Swift is for iOS, yeah.
Okay.
The alternative to Swift that they used to do was C#. And they switched to Swift. Swift apparently runs faster. It's like faster code. C# and Java, I think, both run pretty slow, actually. They're not fast languages. Now we can talk about, like, here's a question. Can you imagine, let's say in Ruby, right? No, we'll get that as we get later deeper into the theory. Never mind. Cool. Now let's talk about, I'm just going to get rid of this. What does a functional language mean? Because I think we kind of covered that. What are languages that, there are some languages that are primarily for functional programming. Y'all know of any?
Not really.
So one of them is Haskell is a popular one. Another one is Scala. I've never dealt with any of these. Another one that was made by the same people that made Ruby, and it looks really similar to Ruby, is Elixir. And I think Elixir is really built for functional programming. But yeah. Did that clear some things up as far as like how all these are out there? And
Yeah, definitely. I really appreciate this rundown.
yeah, I thought
me
this would be a
too.
good lesson. Like they almost canceled it. I'm like, no, let me teach it. I want to.
I
So-
can Google it, but it's like I want this described to me like for dummies, you know?
Right. Well, I think
I hear that.
getting, like, it's cool kind of getting like a map of all the different stuff, I think.
And just like a feel for like what things even are. So like framework versus language, and like what
Right.
the different languages do, and
No,
just kind of-
exactly. It's tough getting that. Okay, so now we're going to get into these 3 questions about typing, which I explained to Cassie a lot this morning.
yeah,
So this might be a little redundant for you, but
that's
fine.
okay. That's
Cool.
okay.
So what is strong versus weak typing? Cassie, why don't you try and give that an answer?
Okay, I'm gonna give it a shot. Okay, so the strong versus weak typing. So the strong was like, that's not the one where you have to declare the thing. That's implicit versus explicit, right? Strong versus weak was like if you put like variable A equals a string and variable B equals a number
Yeah.
in like a strong typing format, they will not be interpolated together when you return A plus B. And in a
Yeah.
weak
So what I
typing-
would say is like, this is how rigorously the language follows the rules, right?
So Ruby is like a rule follower and JavaScript's like a little loose.
Yes. So let's show the difference. In Ruby, if I write A equals 5, and then I say B equals, I want, actually, let's do, yeah, I want, and then I say C, we'll say start. And then we'll say count. Oh, I probably can't use end. I'll probably have to use ending equals waffles. If I try to say puts start plus count plus ending, what do we think is going to happen?
It'll be that, it'll be able to, or no, it won't be able to do add the count in. It can't just add an integer in like that.
Right. You can't add an integer and a string in Ruby. No implicit conversion of an integer into a string. Let's try the same thing in JavaScript. So I'm just going to do let, these could all be const, but whatever. Let, cool. Now if I console.log this, hey, that works. That means that when it created this statement, it didn't ask itself, oh, are these 3 things the same data type? Because I really probably shouldn't be able to add 2 things that are different data types. That doesn't seem right to me. JavaScript says, let me try and figure out what this person meant. That's what makes it weak typing.
So typing has more to do with the data types.
Yes, data types is like what all the typing stuff is going to be related to. But there's 3 classifications of like typing stuff. There's like strong versus weak, dynamic versus static, and implicit versus explicit. We'll talk about this right now. Dynamic versus static. So for this one, we're going to compare. And here, let's do a quick comparison. We're just going to do JavaScript, Ruby, and Dart. And then if you have questions about other languages, we probably could look it up. but this will also help you decide on other languages what's going on. So in JavaScript, weakly typed. Dart, strongly typed. Ruby, strongly typed. I did that I said it in a different order than I was typing it, so forgive me. But both of these are strongly typed. JavaScript is weakly typed. All right, now let's get to dynamic versus static typing. You'll just take my word for it with Dart until I get to it. So now we're doing dynamic versus static. Here I'm just going to compare Ruby and Dart. So if I say count equals 5, and then I say count equals hello, this is a different data type than that. But it can change. That's totally valid in Ruby. I can change count from being a number to a string. Let's try the same thing in Dart. So in Dart, you just have to start everything inside of a main class. Don't worry about that for right now. But I'm going to literally say, I have a string of greeting, and that equals hello. And then I am going to say greeting equals 1. And hey, it's going to tell me that there's an error because I can't just change the type of greeting. I can't assign a value of integer to a variable that's typed string. This is what static typing means. It means that the type, once you declare it, cannot change.
So it's kind of like let and const
Right.
in a way.
Sort of. No. It's actually not like let and const, which is maybe confusing because it goes in the exact same spot. Let and const is more about scoping and redeclaring. We'll go into let and const in a bit. But there's keywords in Dart that kind of match those as well. But yeah, those do allow for different like flexibility. So
That's the exact same thing I said this morning, Alex.
What? Kind of like
The let and const thing. When
Well,
we
yeah,
ran over this.
it's confusing because you look at this and I see string greeting, and that's exactly where a let or a const would go. But this is actually specifically referring to the type. It actually does a little bit of that as well. Like this would be like the equivalent of let combined with declaring it as a string,
Right.
because by default it will allow me to change it. And if I want this to not change, there's a keyword I could put on it. I just can't remember. There's two. There's like final is one of them, and then there's, let's see, create a constant variable in Dart. Oh, so it's a const keyword. Yep. So in here I can use like in Dart I could put something like a, whoa, I have two Dart pads open. I was like, what's going on? I can also put const on here, and now I can't change it. So what does this do? I think const might be go before it. Yep. So now if I try and change it, greeting equals sup, it's going to break. Oh, well, that's going to break for that reason. But and what does it tell me here? It tells me that constant variables can't be assigned a value. There's other weird ones in Dart that are kind of cool, like final. And I think this can be reset once and then never again. But I'm not sure what it says here. Yeah. So what you could do is something like this. This is kind of trippy. Don't worry too much about it. Greeting. I might have to set it or something. Whatever. We'll deal with that another time. That's Dart stuff. That's not even about this lesson. So cool. All right. So dynamic versus static typing. We're going to say once you declare and that's what static is. So let's, and this is dynamic would be the opposite. So let's talk about which one's which. JavaScript would be definitely dynamic. Ruby would be dynamic. Maybe it would be better if we did this. Dynamic, and then we'll list them. Static.
Is this what talking code classes are like? I've never been to one. Is it kind of like this type stuff?
Can be. Yeah, I think so. A lot of the times, yeah. So dynamic, JavaScript. We can go Ruby is dynamically typed. I think Python is, but I'm not actually sure. A lot of the languages will work in, I don't know, we could test to see if it is if we want. Here, look, ready? A equals 5. A equals hello. Let's see if that breaks it. And then we'll print A. Let's see. Let's find out. It's interesting how you could like test this stuff yourself, right? Once you understand what they mean. So I'm just going to run Python 3, python.py. Hey, looks like it's weakly, not weakly typed. Looks like it's dynamically typed. Can you do A plus 5? Will that work? Is it strongly typed? I don't actually know. Nope, doesn't like it. So it's really similar to Ruby in that respect. Cool. Nice. Static would be Dart. Java is like this. C# is like this. I'm pretty sure at least. A lot of those OOP languages are like this. What else? I'm pretty sure some of these functional programs are like that too, but I really don't know. So I wouldn't be the best at telling you. But like I could also tell you though that like typing of stuff and like whether or not it's OOP is not like you could do strong typing in a functional programming language. The two are not necessarily related. Cool. Now, implicit versus explicit typing. What does this mean?
That has to do with syntax, right?
Sort
How
of.
much syntax sugar it has.
Kind of, yeah. So we can look at just JavaScript versus Ruby for this. I'm sorry, we can't. We still have to look at this because this is still implicit. JavaScript is still implicit typing. So if I say let count equals 5, where am I telling it that it's an integer? I'm not, right? So since I'm not telling it that it's an integer, JavaScript is still implicitly typed. We can look this up.
I mean, that's kind of the same.
Same as Ruby.
Is this the umbrella term when it for static and dynamic?
No, this is a separate thing from static and dynamic, right? So in theory, I could have like a Ruby thing be statically typed if I wanted to, because here, if I have an integer, right, of 5, in theory, I could make my language such that if I try to change this to hello, then it will break. But that's not how Ruby works. So even though Ruby is implicitly typed, it theoretically, if someone were to rewrite a language that's similar, they could rewrite a language that is both implicitly typed and statically typed. There might be complications that occur as a result, but the two are separate like features of the language, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So awesome. I blanked out for a second. Now, something that is explicitly typed would be, hey, int number equals 1, right? I'm saying my number equals 1 and my number is an integer. I'm telling my line of code what type it is. Cool. Cool. So let's have that. Implicit typing determines the type based off of the value that you set it to. Okay, here's a question about implicit typing. Do you think that an implicit or explicit typing language would be faster?
Explicit.
Why?
It just doesn't have to think as hard and guess as much when it's
Exactly.
comparing
There's
values.
less logic in guessing what type this thing is.
It's just, I feel like with implicit, I mean, you're still letting it know what it is with using quotations. It's just different.
Yeah, I think it's known though that implicit will slow down a language usually.
Right.
Cool. And then also you have less flexibility in how you write your code, right? If things are implicitly typed, in some ways you have more flexibility, right? Like because, no, I mean, not really. It's easier to write code is what I would say without breaking something. But you also maybe can do less checking and stuff like that. And also there's other things you lose too. Like I'm trying to think of one I could explain, like, for now, we'll just go with the fact that it like stops like checking and stuff. Like, yeah. Okay, so one of the things that I really want to talk to y'all about is the advantages to this like, why would you use a strongly typed language?
Yeah, I kind of want to know like what works best for what scenarios type stuff.
Yeah, so in general, you can create safety for your app. Let me show you what I mean. We can start with just the type safety associated with like Ruby. Let's say I have, no, let's go straight to Dart. Let's say I have a function, and let's make a function that does like, I don't know, find a sum of an array. So sum array, bam, bam. This is how you write functions in here. I have to tell it what it returns. So it returns a number, and it takes in a list of numbers. This I could say int. So it's a list of integers, and we'll call it input array. And this should probably say int. If I wanted to make this more general, whoops, I could actually make this say double. A double in Dart is just like a floating number. And Dart's actually a good language for me to show you this on, because Dart by design actually reads pretty similarly to JavaScript, right? So let's say I make this function, and this is for my app, and I'm working on a huge code base, right? Well, what am I going to do? I'm going to return, let's see if I could not fuck up this syntax, but input array dot reduce, and then for each, this should look really familiar. Cool. I need that. Sweet. So all this thing does is sum an array of numbers, right? So let's check it out. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to type in sum array 1, 2, 3. And I am going to print this. Okay. Bam. Will it work? Hey, it worked. Cool. That means I'm getting a little bit better at Dart. I don't completely suck at it. Cool. So what if I tried to pass the wrong thing in? What if later on someone sees sum array and they think that it like will give me the length of the array, or it will sum together all of the, you know, like maybe I have an array of objects and I want to sum together all of their ages, and someone thinks that that's how this array works, right? So let's just do empty objects. I'll provide it with empty objects. Well, before anything, it's going to break right here. It breaks right here because it says, hey, you can't even put that in this function. You're not allowed to put that in this function. You can't do that. This has to be a list of numbers. This has to be a list of floating numbers. And if you're not providing me a list of floating numbers, you're fucking up. That's called type safety. That's saying, oh, okay, all these functions, it's all, and another benefit you get from it is usually your like text editor will be able to tell you information about that function. So when I open this up, let's see if I can get it to show me anything. So it says that it works better in the actual Flutter editor, but when you like make one cool thing about strongly typed languages that it's just not showing because it's just Dart pad instead of my editor. Strongly typed languages in general, when you write a function or something like that, it gives you information of what that function is supposed to accept. So like if I were in maybe like my my actual app, if when I invoke this, I would see some information pop up that says, oh, some array, you're supposed to put a list of integers into this. So as I'm coding, it will tell me, oh, I have to put a list of integers into this function. Does that make sense? But a lot of the reason why we build this, because it's not easier to write. You know, it's not easier to write in a strongly typed language. What it is that as time goes on, it's easier to read, and it's easier to, and also you like there's certain errors that you can avoid as a result, which is kind of cool. In general, I haven't met like experienced developers that don't like strongly typed languages. Like I'm talking about like people who've been programming for 10 years, not people who've been programming for a year. It takes a long time, I think, to develop that appreciation from what I've heard. So,
The only way out is through.
exactly. Cool. All right. There's also something I wanted to point out is that there's some stuff that we have to worry about with lower level programming that we don't usually have to worry about with higher level programming. These are things that I'll let you kind of go down your own rabbit holes if you want, but like memory leaks, pointers, there's some other shit that I really don't know because I've never programmed in a lower level language. That's never been my thing so far. But there's a whole bunch of shit that you don't have to worry about in high level programming that you do have to worry about in low level programming. That's kind of why like Dart for me is like a step towards going lower because strongly typed is like difficult for me. So my thinking is I start with something like Dart, eventually move to something like C++. Awesome. Now, as far as syntax goes, I think this is pretty self-explanatory. Different languages have different syntaxes. Syntax is usually the easiest part to learn about a language. It's usually not that hard. It's like one of those things that sounds scary, and then you just look at a few examples of how it's made, and the syntax is not the hard part. The hard part is figuring out like the architecture of like, oh, what is happening? What is the order in which things load? Where is this package being imported from? How does this thing handle asynchronous code? These are all the things that really fuck me up when I'm learning a new language, not really like the syntax. Like, because for me, like for a good comparison would be in JavaScript, this is an anonymous function. In Dart, this is an anonymous function. Not all that different, right? All I need to know is what is the Dart equivalent for this thing in JavaScript, and now I've contextualized it. It's pretty easy to remember. So if the syntax of a language scares you, usually it's not actually the syntax, it's some other feature of the language that's scaring you.
Programming.
Yeah. Well, there could be things that are scary about languages, don't get me wrong. But I would say like, unless something has garbage, shitty poo-poo syntax, which that felt weird saying, but you know, like I've rarely ran into circumstances where the syntax is the thing that's throwing me off. Languages
Did you say garbage, silly poo-poo syntax?
Yes, I think I said something along those lines. Okay. So I would say unless it's something, there are stupid languages out there, but like there are ones that are stupid by design. There's like white space programming languages. There's one that literally all of the programming language is in white space. This is valid code in that language.
Ooh.
That
Oh,
would be the
that's
definition of
weird.
garbage, shitty poo-poo syntax, in my opinion. There's also languages like Kitty Script, I think is one.
Oh, you said garbage shitty. I thought it was garbage silly.
Garbage, shitty.
No,
poo-poo.
Kitty Script is something else. I said Kitty Script. You know what? I think Script Kitties is the name for like like shitty hackers. I think that's like what that means, but I'm
Oh,
not
the
sure.
script kitties.
I think it's like a nickname for shitty hackers. But there's other language. There's like LOL script, I'm pretty sure. No, there's like languages that exist just as a joke.
Kind of like cryptocurrency.
Yeah, I'm trying to find one. There's some dumb ones. I thought stupid programming languages. Let's see. Oh, this is a language. Getting the idea? Yeah, me neither.
I think it's LOL code.
LOL code is what I was thinking of. Yeah, I was like, LOL script, where's that? This is like valid LOL code right here.
Put that
Oh,
on the
that one is
resume.
So cute.
Yeah, if one of y'all do LOL code for a
For project.
I'm
capstone,
thinking my capstone.
you'd be a legend. I'm just letting you know.
Wait, so do all these have like their own frameworks and like
Can they achieve all the same things as the other languages?
object
No,
oriented?
that's what I'm probably not. LOL code
Yeah.
framework. I'm curious if anybody's ever made LOL code web framework.
That's him.
A minimal HTTP server written in LOL code. Yeah, if you could if you could do a back end in LOL code, I think that would make you a legend.
Kelso.
I'm gonna be the first.
Welcome to Raffle on Rails. It was created to showcase pre-processed
That's amazing.
type and has framework into the terminal. Man, if one of y'all make a Raffle on Rails server, I am just gonna be so proud of you.
We'll get a job at Flatiron right away.
Yeah. All right, cool. What other questions do we have? Is there anything that I missed?
This was nice, just like to.
Oh yeah, which
Learn all
languages
the
are the
stuff.
fastest? This is a good comparison. This would be a good one if you're curious. So like I know Dart, one of its claims to fame is that it's like almost twice as fast as JavaScript.
Why would you need something to go faster? Is it just if there's like a lot of it?
All right, so here's a question. Let's say my job as a company is that I can compute something the fastest. I can calculate like this number faster than anybody else can, right? Well, I'm trying to think of a good example.
I guess it only really makes a difference if you have a lot of code to sort through, right?
Not if you have a lot of code to sort through, because I'm not talking about how fast it is to code. I'm talking about how fast it runs, right? So there are certain jobs that their primary cost is literally running a computer. Think about something like running a simulation, right? If you're running like a simulation in a really popular library for like artificial intelligence is called Tensorflow, for example. TensorFlow, you actually write TensorFlow, you can write it in Python, but it winds up actually creating C++ code. And it's really good that it creates C++ code because C++ code runs way fucking faster than Python does. So when you're doing something that's computationally expensive, yes, it could make a difference. Like I know people who have ran calculations that took a day to run, right? Let's say you wrote your calculation in C++. That's going to run like, I'm pretty sure 100 times faster than like Python. Like it can make a big difference. So you could be talking in that circumstance, the difference between a day and 100 days, right?
Is that primarily why you're learning Dart? Because you're like working really
No.
hard to learn it.
No, that's not why I'm learning Dart. I'm learning Dart because of Flutter. Dart isn't that fast of a language. Like I don't think if you were to compare Dart compared to JavaScript is faster by like 2.1 times or something like that. But let's look at like C++ versus Python speed test. Something like that. You can like look at charts is maybe the best way. They ran the same program. It looks like in different languages. And here they're showing, I guess these are the different tests that they ran. But here, look, Python is all the way up there. Perl is down here. C++ is like barely a dot, right? So for a lot of these, C++ is literally running like 100 times faster or more, right? Like that, you can imagine if I'm running calculations all the time, right? Let's say I'm a computer. Let's say I'm a company that rents supercomputers, kind of like Amazon, right? That's kind of what they do. They rent out computers for people to borrow, right? Well, that means I'm charging someone to use my computer. And if someone writes their code for my computer and it actually executes 100 times faster, that means it's going to cost them 100 times less. So it really depends on what you're doing. And that's why there's kind of like this spectrum of low to high end languages. A really good one that's like somewhere above C++, but below like JavaScript. JavaScript, by the way, runs a lot faster than Python. And let's look at this. JavaScript versus Ruby speed test. And I think Python and Ruby are kind of similar. Here's a good one. This is a runtime that they did, and they compared different languages. JavaScript is almost as slow as like Go. It's kind of hard to tell how much slower C is than JavaScript from this example.
Wait, so what average runtime on so Ruby is okay.
Slow. Ruby is slow.
Kelsey, you've done a lot with JavaScript, haven't you?
Yeah, like mods 3 through 5.
It's like all JavaScript and React, yeah?
Yeah, it's JavaScript and React. React is a JavaScript framework or library.
So to summarize this a little bit, when you're trying to pick a language to use for something, it's like load time or speed is a factor. It's the safety. So like, I guess catching errors in your code. And that's all.
Yeah, well, it's like, it depends. So like, first of all, you're a JavaScript developer. There's a lot of JavaScript developers. If I'm making a website and it's easier for me to hire a JavaScript developer, that might be the only factor that matters. Like, how many people that develop in Go are going to want to build a whole website in Go? They usually don't do that. Go is usually for, like, Go is like a low end language, or lower end. It's not as low end as like C++. But point is that, you know, it just depends on what you're trying to do. Like, you want to make things like, there's also like factors that have nothing to do with speed or how easy it is to read. Like Ruby, for example, apparently Ruby blew up as a language because of Ruby on Rails. So because someone created a framework that people really liked, Ruby got popular. That's why Ruby got popular, not because it was fast, not because it was easy to read, but because the framework that they built was really useful at the time in which it came out, right? So like, there's so many factors that go into like why these languages exist, which one you should choose, right? Unfortunately, that's just the way things are. But if you choose one and stick with it, that works. if you want to float around and check out some until you find one that you like, that works too. You'll learn kind of different things. You won't learn the same doing it either way, but yeah.
So like if your primary goal is to like build web applications and like and eventually like mobile apps and stuff like that, like you can achieve those goals with JavaScript and React Native ? Like that's the
Can you repeat what you said?
so like if your goal is to like work on web applications and build websites and like also mobile apps and just kind of like be a part of that, like learn JavaScript.
You could just know JavaScript for all of that.
JavaScript, React,
Yeah,
and then
and
like
the reason why you could just know JavaScript for all of that is because someone wrote code that converts JavaScript into like whatever you need to get like an app in the App Store. Someone wrote code that does that conversion for you, so you don't have to. So that's like,
So you
that
don't
could
have
be a
to
whole
learn-
nother, what? Sorry, go for it.
for like a mobile app, you don't have to learn anything other than JavaScript.
Technically, no. React is a JavaScript thing, so it's a JavaScript library.
And you use React for mobile apps?
You use React for mobile apps. Yep.
Okay.
So you could use, well, you use React Native for mobile apps. You use React for just like front end websites.
Okay.
Yeah, it's so confusing learning all this stuff. So like, I really like these high level classes where it's just like, hey, here's kind of like a bunch of concepts. Let's talk about these, because otherwise you're just going down Googling rabbit holes, and you'll probably go on more Googling rabbit holes, but hopefully that was a helpful lesson.
Yeah, it is helpful because I felt a little bit chaotic, and like I feel like this type of lesson really like just kind of helps me understand how all the things kind of.
Awesome.
Yeah, this was super cool. I think like looking at job postings and stuff, like just trying to like decipher that. And like, I guess this might be like good for another lesson, but like what languages are good for what? Like if you want to do like.
Oh yeah, that's something I was about to say. I think I'd be down to talk about some of that now. Python is kind of like an everything language now. The reason why it's an everything language is because it got picked up by like academia. So like academics started using it, so it became really popular. For example, like my cousin is like a professor at Tufts University, and he knows like Python because Python just kind of like makes sense to scientists, right?
So it's like data science stuff and like
Yeah,
science in general.
But then also because the community was so big for it, it also became popular for, I don't know, making back-end websites. You could make front-end websites in Python. You could do all that stuff. It's not as, I feel like it's weird making front-end websites in a language that's not JavaScript for me, because JavaScript is like the language of the web. But yeah, you can do it in other languages as well, because it all winds up getting compiled to JavaScript, right?
What's Python's front end framework?
I don't know, but I'm pretty sure one exists. There's all sorts of tools for Python because the community is probably like, I want to say it's that and JavaScript, I want to say, are the biggest communities in programming, but I don't know for sure.
And then there's a big difference between open source and then private language. Does that mean that like, so Python's
Open source means a company doesn't own it.
Do you have to pay?
There's usually like individuals who are heading it or something like that, but like a company doesn't a particular company does not have ownership of that.
So like I know C# Microsoft does, but like, does that mean you have to pay them to use it for?
It used to mean that if you wanted to use Microsoft, that you'd have to pay for their framework. But turns out that once other frameworks, competitors started coming out that, you know, like worked well, they couldn't do that anymore. They can't charge anybody to do that shit.
And I guess another question I have is like,
so to give you some ideas on my opinions on some of this stuff, John opinions, this will be the last part of this.
yay.
And all of this stuff, bear in mind who I am and what my industry experience is. So like to give you an intro to like my background, I have a background in sciencey stuff. I had like an engineering degree, and also like I don't have any real world development experience, but I've talked with a fair amount of them. So just to forewarn what my experience is, these are like my opinions on different languages. Python, I don't like the language, but there are cool jobs related to it. So if you ever wanted to get into like mathy stuff, Python is a great one.
Wait, did you say math or map?
Mathy.
Math. Okay.
Mathy stuff would be good for Python. Python has a shit ton of math libraries. If you ever wanted to get into artificial intelligence, Python is also popular with startups for the reason that I said before, which is just that it's super fucking popular in academia. So a lot of times, like if I went and got a science degree and then I want to get into the tech industry, I might know Python. So start learning a Python framework instead of JavaScript. So I might try, making my backend in Django because I don't want to learn JavaScript. I'm more comfortable in Python. So that's kind of like my opinion on Python there. So also it's popular with startups is basically what I would say there. Cool. Let's talk about
Like if you have a science degree and want to get into a sciencey thing, Python might be a good choice. Okay.
Yes, for sure. Let's talk about Ruby. Ruby tends to be older companies, like more established. Currently, I like making Ruby backends. Like that's my favorite way to make backends. It's fucking fast. So I could actually imagine using Ruby on personal projects. I would rather use Ruby than Python. For if it were something simple, I would probably build it in Ruby instead of Node. The only reason why I'm working on a Node backend right now is just because my friend wants to do it that way. So I'm like, okay, I'll learn something new. So a lot of times, one of the implications of working in a code base that's already established is you're going to be doing less new shit and more of debugging old shit. The same is true for Java, C#. I'm trying to think of what other languages, but there's this concept of legacy software, meaning that if someone were to make this same thing again, they wouldn't build it the same way. But because they built it in this language, they have to maintain it in this language. So personally, that's not the kind of job I want to get. I don't want to get a job like maintaining software that was made a long time ago. I want to be working on making something new. Like that's where I'd like to be personally. But that's just like personal preference. That's not, you might actually fit in well at a job where someone gives you a bug ticket every day, and you have to just figure out what's wrong with the code and debug that. That's fine. That's like a totally valid thing. And there is a shit ton of jobs around legacy software like that. So just my opinion there. All right, then what about some JavaScript? So JavaScript as a language, everybody has to know JavaScript. That is related to web stuff. Because ultimately, that's what it gets compiled to on your web browser. So everybody's got to know JavaScript to some degree, even if you're not a beast at it. But if you specialize in JavaScript, you could do things like Node backends, you could do front ends. There's machine learning libraries also that exist, but they're not that techie mathy community is not as established as it is for Python. But there is some techie mathy stuff you could do with JavaScript and not Python. I like JavaScript. I think it's fun to program in. Yeah, that's my opinions on that. Dart, Flutter is not popular for major companies at all. But good Flutter developers can make apps really fast. So a lot of times, from what I could tell, Flutter developers will be able to like beat out like React Native developers in price. But there's also a lot less Flutter developers. But they can, the thing is that they can make apps faster. It's like better for like a rapid development thing. And also the reason why I'm personally learning, the reason why I'm personally learning Dart and enjoy that and will continue to enjoy that is because it's going to teach me concepts that will make me a better developer. So would any other of these languages. To me, I was attracted to the fact that this is strongly, statically, all that shit, strongly typed, right? That's part of what attracted me to it. So that also might make you not want to learn it, and that's totally fine. The framework is fucking nice to work with. I will say I worked with Flutter and I worked with React Native, and Flutter is just smoother as far as like you reload a phone, it reloads quickly. What other opinions do I have? I think that's good enough for now. Y'all take a lunch.
I love this opinions thing. I feel like we need like a Christine opinions class, an Ed opinions